Aloha! The King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, in cooperation with Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages and the National Park Service, present Law, War, and Racism in the Pacific, Martial Law during World War II. Martial law is not mentioned in the United States Constitution, nor is it defined by state or federal statutes. Acceptance of martial law, therefore, lies in its role in protecting constitutional and statutory provisions. These include Congress's ability to call out the militia for suppressing insurrections and repelling invasions, and acts of Congress authorizing the President to employ the Army, Navy, and militia to put down insurrections against federal or state authority. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and other American military bases on Oahu. The raid killed 2,390 American soldiers and civilians and wounded more than 1,100. The territorial government's pre-existing exaggerated fears of Japanese Americans played an important role in amplifying the disaster. Almost as soon as the Japanese bombing occurred, Territorial Governor Joseph Poindexter invoked the provisions of the Hawaii Defense Act to put the islands on a war footing. The Hawaii Defense Act gave broad powers to the territorial governor in case of war, with minimal safeguards for constitutional rights. The same day, U.S. Army General Walter Short visited Governor Poindexter and warned of the urgent menace of sabotage by local Japanese. Poindexter was pressured to sign a special martial law proclamation prepared by the Army Provost Marshal General. General Short promised that once the immediate crisis was over, civilian authority would be returned within a few weeks. President Roosevelt quickly agreed to the imposition of martial law and the suspension of habeas corpus. General Short declared himself military governor. With these powers in hand, the Army arrested over 1,000 Issei and Nisei and held them without charge in an Army-run camp at the Sand Island Immigration Station. They were later moved to an Army concentration camp at Honouliuli in leeward Oahu. On December 17th, 10 days after the outbreak of war, a new commander, General Delos Emmons, arrived in Hawaii and assumed the post of military governor. Under Emmons, martial law continued in force and the U.S. Constitution was suspended. Military authorities issued a series of 181 general orders, which overturned existing territorial law and regulated all aspects of civilian life. The new regulations were generally applied in a race-neutral fashion, but it was widely understood that they existed largely to control the local Japanese, and some measures specifically targeted this population. For instance, Japanese schools were shuttered by official decree and the buildings seized. The two chief Japanese language newspapers, Hawaii Hochi and Nippu Jiji, were closed for 4 weeks. Entry to the West Lock area of Pearl Harbor was limited for those of Japanese ancestry. Farmers who lived in the vicinity were forced to relocate their residences, although they were permitted to enter the area to work their farms during daylight hours. 1,500 residents were ordered out of Honolulu's Iwilei district near Honolulu Harbor overnight. Local Japanese faced a mixture of support and hostility. Various non-Japanese residents, from U.S. Attorney Angus Taylor to University of Hawaii professor Albert Horlings, warned that local Japanese were massively disloyal, although their charges were rebutted by official sources. One esteemed businessman, John Balch, put together various manifestos calling for local Japanese to be confined. To counter such hostility, an interracial race relations group headed by Shigeo Yoshida and others organized patriotic campaigns and pointed to the supportive activities of local Japanese after Pearl Harbor. In the days following his arrival, General Emmons ordered the Nisei of the newly organized Hawaiian Territorial Guard armed, using scarce munitions at hand, and mobilized to maintain public safety and protect military bases. Nisei troops helped secure the defense of the islands. However, pressure rose both in Hawaii and the continental U.S. to disarm Japanese Americans. On January 21, 1942, Emmons ordered the 317 Nisei serving in the Territorial Guard discharged without warning. Those dismissed would later form a volunteer labor battalion, dubbed the Varsity Victory Volunteers, to contribute to the war effort and demonstrate their loyalty. In a further sign of mistrust, Emmons created a businessman's military training corps made up of white and non-Japanese residents who were charged with watching the local Japanese. Army battalions with Japanese Americans were confined to quarters and eventually sent off for training in Wisconsin to ensure that they would stay far from the Pacific Theater. General Emmons did, however, succeed in scuttling plans proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of the Navy and endorsed by President Roosevelt for mass roundup and confinement of Japanese Americans in Hawaii, either by transportation to camps on the mainland or by concentration on the island of Molokai. The fact that Japanese Americans remained at large gave the Army a pretext for resisting the handover of power to civilian authority. Colonel Thomas Greene, the military's chief executive officer, was a staunch advocate for the continuation of martial law. It was Greene who drew up the martial law proclamation, and Greene who created an organizational plan that left Hawaii with a status resembling that of a conquered province. Over the ensuing months, as Greene put through the military orders that regulated life in Hawaii, he confiscated relief funds granted by Congress and used the proceeds to hire civilian employees to carry out official functions instead of using the civilian government. From the outset, a prominent feature of the martial law regime designed by Greene was the imposition of military tribunals enacted under General Order 4. Although civilian courts were permitted to reopen a week after the attacks, they were restricted to civil cases. All criminal cases were tried by a network of military commissions and provost courts established by the military governor's office. These military tribunals, presided over by armed officers generally untrained in law, were classic examples of drumhead justice, unfettered by rules of evidence, a presumption of innocence, or constitutional safeguards for fair trials. The case of Sanji Abe illustrates the embattled position of Japanese Americans under martial law. Abe, a World War I veteran and former Honolulu policeman, was the lone Nisei senator elected to the pre-war territorial legislature. Despite or because of his position, Abe seems to have been closely watched by the military authorities once the war began. On August 2, 1942, he was arrested and charged with possession of a Japanese flag, supposedly found among other stage property in a theater of which Abe was part owner. Abe protested that he had never bought or flown any Japanese flag, and that the military orders making possession of Japanese flags a crime were not issued until August 8, 6 days after his arrest. Army officials were forced to release him on August 19th. Even after he publicly burned the offending flag, he remained under suspicion. In September 1942, Colonel Greene had Abe rearrested, this time without charge, and placed in custodial detention, where he remained for 19 months. There was little audible opposition in Hawaii to martial law or military justice. Neither the Hawaii Bar Association nor local businessmen groups, who were delighted by the outlawing of strikes and curbs on labor, voiced opposition. As late as December 27, 1942, the Honolulu Chamber of Commerce praised the military government as eminently fair and considerate of our civil rights. The local press, subjected to official censorship and influence of the Army's propaganda apparatus, were also supportive. The film you are about to watch tells the story of the imposition of martial law in Hawaii during World War II and the racist policies entrenched in its execution.
The governor of Hawaii has placed the territory under martial law, and has required all persons to obey such proclamations, orders, and regulations as I may issue during the present emergency. Any violation of this duty is treason and will be punished by the severest penalties. Good citizens will cheerfully obey. Walter C. Short, U.S. Army, commanding.
My dad was reading me the morning funnies, and all of a sudden there was this huge explosion that it rocked the whole house. And I'll never forget the sight of that black smoke, horrible black smoke.
When I was in a class of democracy, FBI came. The principal came to the class and said, "Hey, Harry, you come out." I said, "Yes." So said, "You come to the principal office."
The night of December 7th is when I realized that we were at war with Japan, because my dad was taken that night.
December 7th, which is my birthday. That's when the war broke out. And so things were forbidden, activities were forbidden, not being able to go out at night. And the mere fact of having barbed wire on the beaches, the amount of people, especially the armed forces, dominating the beach scene, getting into fights with the Beach Boys. It was a traumatic experience, I think, for all of us in that time. And I think to cover up all of that is we were very active on the beach and naughty, you know.
In a climate of fear, the military's takeover of civilian government in Hawaii seemed almost logical and natural. With the public imagination inflamed by rumors, people lived in dread of a second air raid or an invasion. To prevent a Japanese force from capturing American cash, U.S. currency was stamped with the word Hawaii. If people could flee the islands, they often fled. The military censored the mail and also listened in on private telephone calls. Speaking anything but English on the telephone was banned. Everyone over the age of 6 was fingerprinted. Everyone was required to carry an identification card, as well as a gas mask. The blacking out of light at night, the blackout, would be most widely remembered.
When you're worried about the blackout, when you're worried about gas, when you're worried about whether your kids will get to school, whether or not the gas masks will work for the kids. If you're an ordinary worker, you don't worry about the constitutionality of martial law. What you worry about is how can we get the family through this particular crisis.
The American tradition of checks and balances among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches was replaced by a military governor whose powers were not checked. His general orders suspended the right of free assembly, free expression, free movement, and trial by jury. Military officers, untrained in the practice of law, sat as judges, handing out harsh sentences to the individuals who passed through their courts.
It meant that people didn't have rights, that these courts were rapid-fire proceedings. Most of them lasted only a few minutes. 99.9% of the people brought into the court for criminal matters were found to be guilty. And there was no review, there was no appeal.
The fight over constitutional rights came down to something called habeas corpus.
The writ of habeas corpus is called the Great Writ because it's the ultimate freedom that we have to go to court and to ask the judge to look into why we're being incarcerated. The term means, bring me the body. So the judge issues the writ of habeas corpus, which means that the executive branch officials have to deliver the prisoner to the court and explain why the person is being kept in custody.
Because of press censorship, many people in Hawaii did not know that more than 400 individuals were arrested immediately after December the 7th and held indefinitely without charges. Through the course of the war, this number grew to 1,500. Most were of Japanese ancestry.
Well, the sheriff came, and we were all sleeping, but I could hear my mother crying. And they said that, he'll be back in a few days. They're just going to take him in for questioning. Then a few days later, we were told that we should take some clothes to him. We did get a chance to visit him, and just through a small window, like a cashier's window, and couldn't touch him or anything. And we found out that he was going to be shipped to Sand Island. And then we didn't see him after that until a year and a half later.
Despite the fact that there was never a single case charging espionage or sabotage by a person of Japanese ancestry, fear of the large Japanese ancestry community not only helped get martial law going, but kept it going.
Then there are two FBI men who were standing. So, are you Urata, Harry Urata? I say, yes. So you're under arrest. Oh, just a moment. I like to get my things, brush, toothbrush, all those things. Say, no. You just come with us. Boom.
Beneath the cloak of anti-Japanese sentiment, the constitutional rights of all people were being violated.
That afternoon, there was this car that drove into the yard. And so I ran upstairs, and I was shocked that these guys were running right behind of me. So I was just like, what in the world is happening here? Mom said that, she'd have to put on some lipstick. So she went into the bathroom. The guys were right after her, and I saw a pistol. She turned to me and she said, Doris, take care of your little sister. I'll be right back. They didn't know what in the world was going on. They weren't charged with anything. The FBI kept saying, you're aliens. No, Mom and Dad said, we're American citizens. So she disappeared, and that was it.
Historians were to agree that 7 months after Pearl Harbor, America's victory at the Battle of Midway Island meant that Japan posed no serious threat of invasion. Hawaii's civilian courts were obviously able to function, and in fact always had been able to function. Attorney Garner Anthony took a stand against continuing martial law under these circumstances.
Garner Anthony played a key role because he was smart and very persistent. And of course, many other people were afraid and cowed, and taking on the U.S. military, of course, is always a challenge.
More than a year passed before martial law was lightened. Elements of martial law continued throughout the entire war. After the war ended, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Garner Anthony was right.
Of course, it would have been better if they'd gotten to it earlier, but at least they get to it, and they make a very clear ruling that the civilian courts were open for civil cases, the bars were open, the movie theaters were open. This was a functioning society, and it wasn't a situation where martial law was required.
Supreme Court Justice Franklin Murphy went further.
From time immemorial, despots have used real or imagined threats to the public welfare as an excuse for needlessly abrogating human rights. The right to jury trial and the other constitutional rights of an accused individual are too fundamental to be sacrificed merely through a reasonable fear of military assault. Especially deplorable is this use of the iniquitous doctrine of racism to justify the imposition of military trials. Racism has no place whatever in our civilization. We must be on constant guard against an excessive use of any power, military or otherwise, that results in the needless destruction of our rights and our liberties.